What if I told you the US military submitted signed plans to the president proposing we bomb our own cities and blame it on Cuba, and the documents sat classified for 35 years? That the CIA demonstrated a heart attack gun before Congress in 1975, firing frozen poison darts that left no trace, and the program just quietly continued? That government doctors infected hundreds of black men with syphilis, watched them go blind and die for 40 years, and called it science? These aren't conspiracy theories. They're footnotes buried in official records. If you're ready to see what power actually looks like, hit subscribe. Pour something warm, dim the lights, get comfortable. We're walking through the hidden archives tonight. Let's begin with what they never meant you to find. In the summer of 1934, a retired Marine Corps general named Smedley Butler walked into a congressional hearing room in Washington and testified under oath that wealthy industrialists had approached him to lead a fascist coup against President Franklin Roosevelt. The House Un-American Activities Committee listened, documented his testimony in official records, and then quietly buried the report. Butler had been a 2-time Medal of Honor recipient, the kind of man whose word carried weight in military circles. The plot he described involved forming a veterans' army of 500,000 men to force Roosevelt from power, backed by Wall Street financiers who saw the New Deal as a threat to their interests. Butler named names: DuPont family representatives, J.P. Morgan Associates, leaders from Remington Arms, and other industrial giants. The committee's final report acknowledged that Butler's claims had merit, stating there had been an attempt to establish a fascist organization in this country, but recommended no prosecutions. The story appeared briefly in newspapers, then vanished from national conversation. America moved forward as if one of its most decorated military officers hadn't just testified that corporate leaders tried to overthrow the government. Then the machinery of science turned dark. In 1932, in Macon County, Alabama, Dr. Taliaferro Clark of the U.S. Public Health Service launched what he called the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. The study enrolled 600 black men, 399, with syphilis and 201 without, telling them they were receiving free health care for bad blood. They weren't. Researchers deliberately withheld treatment even after penicillin became the standard cure for syphilis in 1947. For 40 years, doctors watched these men suffer, go blind, experience neurological damage, and die, all while documenting the progression of untreated disease. Public health service records show researchers actively prevented participants from receiving treatment elsewhere, going so far as to list them as ineligible for the draft during World War II, to keep them from getting syphilis screenings that might lead to cure. The study only ended in 1972, when a whistleblower leaked the story to the press. By then, 28 men had died directly from syphilis, 100 from related complications, 40 wives had been infected, and 19 children born with congenital syphilis. It's the kind of arrangement that should have been impossible under medical ethics. Technically, it ran for 4 decades with government funding. While America celebrated victory in 1945, intelligence officers were already making calculations. Operation Paperclip brought more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to the United States immediately after World War II, many of them former Nazi Party members who had worked on weapons programs. Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency files show the military deliberately sanitized personnel records, removing evidence of war crimes and Nazi affiliations to bypass President Truman's explicit prohibition on bringing Nazi Party members into the country. Wernher von Braun, who had used slave labor from concentration camps to build V-2 rockets, became the face of America's space program. Arthur Rudolph, production manager at the metalwork factory where 20,000 prisoners died, helped design the Saturn V rocket. The paperwork was clean. The careers were stellar. In 1984, when the Justice Department finally opened investigations into some of these scientists' wartime activities, Several quietly left the country rather than face questions. The space program's reputation remained unblemished. The surveillance state was taking shape in Manhattan. By August 1956, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had authorized a new domestic intelligence program called COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, targeting American citizens engaged in political activism. Internal FBI memos, leaked in 1971 when activists broke into a field office in Media, Pennsylvania, revealed the program's scope: infiltrating civil rights organizations, monitoring anti-war groups, sabotaging the Black Panther Party, and attempting to disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize groups Hoover deemed subversive. The targets weren't foreign spies. They were Americans exercising First Amendment rights. Agents planted fake letters to create internal divisions, spread rumors designed to destroy marriages, and fed false information to the press to discredit activists. One memo explicitly stated the goal was preventing the rise of a messiah who could unify and electrify the Black nationalist movement. The program ran for 15 years before exposure, targeting thousands of citizens. No FBI agents faced prosecution for the systematic violation of constitutional rights. Now a moment when lies became official policy. On August 4th, 1964, in the Gulf of Tonkin off North Vietnam, U.S. Navy destroyers reported coming under torpedo attack. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara presented these reports to Congress as definitive evidence of North Vietnamese aggression. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution 3 days later, giving President Johnson authorization to escalate military involvement in Vietnam. The problem is the second attack, the one that pushed Congress to act, never happened. NSA documents declassified in 2005 revealed intelligence officers knew within hours that sonar operators had mistaken weather effects and false radar images for enemy torpedoes. McNamara received this information but continued to present the attack as confirmed fact in congressional testimony. As one NSA historian later wrote in an internal report, "It is not simply that there is a different story as to what happened, it is that no attack happened that night. The war that followed killed 58,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese, authorized by Congress based on an incident that didn't occur. What followed sounds like a rejected spy novel." In September 1975, CIA Director William Colby sat before the Church Committee investigating intelligence abuses and confirmed the agency had developed a weapon that fired a frozen dart of shellfish toxin, designed to cause a heart attack, leaving no trace of foul play. The gun itself sat on the committee table during testimony, a modified pistol with a telescopic sight. Colby explained the dart would penetrate clothing, melt in the target's body, and cause cardiac arrest while being undetectable in autopsy. Records showed the CIA had developed the weapon in direct violation of a presidential order to destroy all toxin stockpiles. When asked why the agency had ignored the directive, officials explained they had deemed certain programs too valuable to terminate. Senators asked pointed questions. Television cameras recorded the testimony. The weapon remained on display. Nobody faced criminal charges. The program was simply acknowledged and, officially, ended. But some truths required theft to see daylight. In June 1971, Daniel Ellsberg, a former military analyst working for the Rand Corporation, leaked 7,000 pages of classified documents to the New York Times. The Pentagon Papers, as they became known, detailed decades of government deception about U.S. involvement in Vietnam, revealing that 4 administrations had systematically lied to Congress and the public about the war's progress and prospects. The documents showed President Johnson had escalated bombing campaigns while publicly claiming he sought peace, that the government knew the war was unwinnable years before admitting it, and that officials had deliberately misled the American people about casualties, strategy, and objectives. The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that the Times had the right to publish. The Nixon administration, furious about the leak, created a covert unit called the Plumbers to stop leaks and discredit Ellsberg. That unit would soon break into the Watergate complex, setting in motion events that would end a presidency. The Pentagon Papers themselves revealed systematic deception across multiple administrations. The fallout from trying to suppress them brought down Nixon. Which brings us to a hotel in Virginia. On May 28, 1972, 5 men gathered in a hotel room in Arlington to finalize plans for breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex. E. Howard Hunt, a former CIA officer now working for Nixon's re-election campaign, coordinated the operation. White House tape recordings later revealed Nixon and his closest advisors discussing the break-in, the cover-up, and payments to keep the burglars quiet. The phrase smoking gun tape entered American vocabulary after a recording captured Nixon approving hush money and ordering the CIA to block the FBI investigation. The burglary itself was almost comically incompetent. A security guard noticed tape on a door latch and called police. But the cover-up revealed a pattern of abuse, illegal wiretaps, campaign finance violations, use of government agencies to harass political opponents, obstruction of justice. The House Judiciary Committee approved articles of impeachment in July 1974. Nixon resigned August 8th rather than face certain removal. It's the only time an American president has resigned from office, brought down not by the crime but by the systematic lying about it. The next story begins in the shadows of American media. Operation Mockingbird, launched in the early 1950s by CIA official Frank Wisner, transformed American journalism into an intelligence asset. By the time the program faced congressional scrutiny in 1976, investigators discovered the agency had established relationships with more than 400 American journalists and 25 major news organizations. Congressional testimony revealed reporters on the CIA payroll planted stories, shaped coverage of foreign events to align with agency objectives, and used their positions to gather intelligence. The New York Times, CBS, Time magazine, publications Americans trusted for objective reporting, had staff who doubled as intelligence assets. Some journalists knew they were working for the CIA. Others had their copy quietly shaped by editors with agency connections. When the Church Committee investigated, former CIA Director William Colby testified the relationships had been mutually beneficial, with journalists gaining access to information and the CIA gaining influence over how Americans understood world events. As one internal CIA memo put it, the advantage of our direct contact with journalists is that we can plant stories that would otherwise not see the light of day. The program was officially terminated after exposure. Records suggest the practice of intelligence agencies cultivating media relationships continued, just with different code names and administrative structures. Then science became a weapon against unwitting citizens. In April 1953, CIA Director Alan Dulles approved a program called MK-Ultra, authorizing the agency to conduct mind control experiments on American and Canadian citizens without their knowledge or consent. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb led the research, which involved administering LSD and other drugs to subjects ranging from CIA employees to prison inmates to patrons of brothels the agency operated in San Francisco and New York. Senate hearing documents from 1977 revealed the full scope, 149 subprojects involving universities, hospitals, and prisons, with researchers often unaware they were working for the CIA. In one documented case, the agency dosed a scientist named Frank Olson with LSD without his knowledge, then watched as he became psychotic and died after falling from a hotel window, ruled a suicide, though later investigations raised questions about whether he was pushed. Dr. Ewan Cameron at McGill University, funded by MKUltra money channeled through a front organization, subjected psychiatric patients to drug-induced comas lasting weeks, electroshock therapy at many times normal power, and forced listening to repeated messages for hours. His goal was to erase existing memories and reprogram patients. Some never recovered. The program ran for 20 years. When congressional investigations loomed in 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered MKUltra files destroyed. Most records were burned. No one faced prosecution. The CIA issued an apology decades later, calling the program a regrettable excess of the Cold War era. While the nation debated accountability, arms deals were flowing south. Between 1985 and 1986, senior officials in the Reagan administration arranged to sell weapons to Iran, then under an arms embargo, and divert the profits to fund Contra rebels in Nicaragua, circumventing Congress's explicit prohibition on such aid. Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North coordinated the operation from a White House office. The Tower Commission report later documented how National Security Advisor John Poindexter and others created a hidden network of arms sales, secret bank accounts, and falsified documents. When the scheme unraveled, President Reagan gave a televised address claiming he couldn't recall approving the deals. As the investigation revealed in hearings, Reagan had signed documents authorizing arms sales, while publicly denying any such policy existed. The phrase "I don't recall" appeared hundreds of times in testimony from administration officials. North was convicted on 3 felony counts, but an appeals court vacated the convictions because he had testified before Congress under immunity. No senior Reagan administration official served prison time. The pattern was clear: violate congressional restrictions, destroy evidence, claim memory failure under oath, receive pardons or overturned convictions. The banking scandal that followed makes most fraud look amateur. The Bank of Credit and Commerce International collapsed in 1991 after regulators in 7 countries simultaneously shut it down, revealing what a Senate investigation later called one of the largest criminal enterprises in history. Becci, founded in 1972, had facilitated money laundering for drug cartels, arms dealers, and intelligence agencies worldwide. Clark Clifford, former defense secretary and advisor to 4 presidents, served as Becci's U.S. lawyer and chairman of First American Bank, which Becci secretly owned in violation of U.S. law. Senate Banking Committee reports documented how Becci bribed officials, manipulated financial records, and operated what investigators described as a full-service bank for criminals. The bank handled money for the Medellin cartel, the Abu Nidal terrorist organization, and various intelligence services including the CIA, which reportedly used Becci for covert operations. Clifford was indicted but never tried due to his age and health. Most Becci executives fled to countries without extradition treaties. Depositors and legitimate businesses lost billions. It took years to untangle the financial web. The bank had operated in 73 countries with assets exceeding $20 billion, all while systematically facilitating global crime. Then came a teenage girl's testimony that sold a war. On October 10, 1990, a 15-year-old girl named Nayara testified before the Congressional Human Rights Caucus, describing atrocities she witnessed as a volunteer at a Kuwaiti hospital during the Iraqi invasion. Sobbing, she claimed Iraqi soldiers had removed babies from incubators and left them to die on the floor. Her testimony was cited repeatedly by President George H.W. Bush and appeared in the congressional record as evidence justifying military intervention. 7 senators referenced her account when arguing for authorization of military force against Iraq. The Gulf War began in January 1991. Months later, journalists revealed Nayara was actually the daughter of Kuwait's ambassador to the United States, and her testimony had been arranged by Hill & Knowlton, a public relations firm hired by the Kuwaiti government for $11 million to build support for U.S. intervention. Investigators found no evidence the incubator incident occurred. The Congressional Human Rights Caucus, which had hosted her testimony, wasn't an official congressional body and didn't require witnesses to testify under oath. The war proceeded based in part on a fabricated story delivered by a coached teenager, amplified by a sophisticated PR campaign disguised as grassroots outrage. The surveillance that followed made previous programs look quaint. Within weeks of September 11, 2001, at NSA headquarters in Fort Meade, Maryland, Director Michael Hayden authorized a program allowing warrantless surveillance of Americans' phone calls and emails. The program, later revealed through Edward Snowden's leaks in 2013, collected metadata on virtually every phone call made in the United States, who called whom, when, for how long, creating a database of American communications without individual warrants. Documents showed the NSA had direct access to servers of major tech companies, collecting emails, photos, videos, and social media posts. When the program became public, government officials initially claimed it only targeted foreign communications. Later revelations proved the surveillance was far broader, sweeping up domestic communications in what one federal judge would later rule was likely unconstitutional. Congress passed legislation in 2015 nominally restricting the program, but subsequent reports suggested the surveillance infrastructure remained largely intact, operating under different legal frameworks. The gap between what Americans were told about privacy protections and what actually occurred in the digital infrastructure they used daily had become a canyon. Sometimes the FBI created the very threats it claimed to stop. In November 2010, in Portland, Oregon, FBI agents arrested Mohammed Osman Mohammed, a 19-year-old Somali American, for attempting to detonate what he believed was a bomb at a Christmas tree lighting ceremony. Court documents revealed agents had identified Mohammed through email monitoring, made contact through an undercover operative, provided fake bomb materials, drove him to the location, and arrested him the moment he attempted to trigger the device. The bomb was inert, FBI property the entire time. Defense attorneys argued this was entrapment, creating a terrorist where none existed. Similar cases emerged across the country. The FBI would identify young men expressing radical views online, introduce undercover agents posing as terrorists, provide means and plans for attacks, then arrest the targets before execution of plots the FBI had largely orchestrated. Court records showed this pattern repeated dozens of times. In nearly every case, judges ruled the arrests legal and convictions stood. Critics pointed out these cases produced impressive statistics, terrorist plots foiled, arrests made, but raised questions about whether the FBI was catching terrorists or creating them. The program continued, rebranded as combating homegrown violent extremism, and in the darkness of black sites, torture became policy. Starting in 2002, the CIA operated secret detention facilities in Poland, Thailand, Romania, and other countries, where terrorism suspects were held without charge and subjected to enhanced interrogation techniques. Jose Rodriguez, head of the CIA's National Clandestine Service, personally ordered the destruction of 92 videotapes documenting interrogation sessions after learning congressional investigators might seek them. The Senate Intelligence Committee's torture report, released in 2014, documented waterboarding, sleep deprivation for up to 180 hours, confinement in coffin-sized boxes, and rectal feeding, techniques the report concluded were far more brutal than the CIA had represented to policymakers and produced little actionable intelligence. Detainees were held in pitch-black cells, shackled in stress positions, kept in freezing temperatures while naked. Some died in custody. The program had been authorized by legal memos from Justice Department lawyers who redefined torture to permit techniques that clearly violated international law. When the torture program became public, the Justice Department declined to prosecute CIA officers, stating they had relied on legal guidance. Rodriguez retired with full pension. The lawyers who wrote the memos faced no professional sanctions. The black sites were quietly closed, the detainees transferred, and the only person imprisoned in connection with the program was a whistleblower who confirmed its existence. The Pentagon had already drafted its darkest contingency. In March 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff submitted to President Kennedy a document titled Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. Declassified in 1997, the memo detailed Operation Northwoods, a plan to stage terrorist attacks on American soil and blame Cuba to justify invasion. The proposals included sinking boats carrying Cuban refugees, bombing U.S. ships in Guantanamo Bay, orchestrating a terror campaign in Miami and Washington, shooting down a CIA-operated plane disguised as a commercial airliner, and faking an attack on the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Lyman Lemnitzer, signed the document along with every other member. The plan specified creating casualty lists of real Americans to make the false flag operations credible. Kennedy rejected the proposal and removed Lemnitzer as chairman shortly after. The document remained classified for 35 years. When finally released, it confirmed what conspiracy theorists had long suspected: the highest levels of military leadership had formally proposed murdering American citizens as a pretext for war. The memo sat in the National Archives, signed and dated, a bureaucratic artifact of institutional willingness to sacrifice citizens for geopolitical objectives. At the same time, a campaign against one man revealed institutional rot. In November 1964, someone at FBI headquarters mailed an anonymous package to Martin Luther King Jr.'s Atlanta address. Inside was an audio recording of King in hotel rooms with women who weren't his wife, compiled from FBI surveillance, along with an unsigned letter that read in part, "King, there is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You have just 34 days. You are done." The implication was clear: kill yourself or we'll destroy your reputation. Assistant Director William Sullivan had overseen COINTELPRO operations against King, accumulating recordings from wiretaps, placed in hotel rooms where King stayed. The letter reached King 34 days before he was to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. King's associates interpreted it as a suicide suggestion, an attempt to destroy him before he gained international stature. The FBI never apologized. In 1999, a Memphis jury in a civil suit brought by the King family found that government agencies had been involved in a conspiracy surrounding King's assassination 4 years later, though this verdict is widely disputed by historians. What's not disputed is the documented FBI campaign to neutralize King through surveillance, blackmail, and psychological warfare, all while he advocated nonviolent civil rights reform. Then, the agency turned to financing operations off the books. Through the 1980s, allegations circulated that the CIA had involvement in cocaine trafficking in Los Angeles, funneling drugs into black neighborhoods while supporting Nicaraguan Contra rebels. Freeway Ricky Ross, who became one of LA's largest crack dealers, later testified his supplier was connected to CIA-backed operations. Senator John Kerry led an investigation resulting in the 1989 Kerry Committee report, which found that senior U.S. policymakers were not immune to the idea that drug money was a perfect solution to the Contras' funding problems. The report documented that individuals connected to the Contra movement had engaged in drug trafficking, and that U.S. officials had evidence of this but failed to investigate or act. Records showed the State Department paid over $806,000 to 4 companies owned by drug traffickers for humanitarian aid to the Contras. When journalist Gary Webb published a series in the San Jose Mercury News in 1996 detailing these connections, major newspapers attacked his reporting. Webb was eventually pressured out of journalism. Years later, CIA Inspector General Frederick Hitz released reports confirming much of what Webb had written, that dozens of Contra supporters and CIA assets had been involved in drug trafficking, and the agency had blocked investigations. No prosecutions followed. Webb was found dead in 2004 with 2 gunshot wounds to the head, ruled a suicide. Meanwhile, America's elite gathered in the Redwoods. Every summer since the 1870s, powerful men have gathered at Bohemian Grove, a 2,700-acre campground in Northern California owned by the Bohemian Club. Membership rosters documented over the decades include presidents, CIA directors, corporate CEOs, and defense contractors. In July 1942, during the height of World War II, meetings at the Grove included Manhattan Project planning sessions. Member lists were periodically leaked, showing Supreme Court justices, cabinet members, and media executives mixing in what they called the world's most exclusive men's club. Photographs and recordings smuggled out showed grown men in robes performing mock human sacrifice rituals before a 40-foot stone owl. Members insisted it was harmless fun, a place where powerful people could relax without scrutiny. Critics noted that when the people making decisions about war, economic policy, and regulation all belong to the same private club, the line between social gathering and conspiracy becomes harder to draw. The club operated without public oversight, denying entry to journalists. What was discussed in these closed sessions remained largely unknown, though occasionally members would later reference Grove conversations and interviews about major policy decisions. Public denials about the Grove's significance continued even as documents showed it had served as a venue for substantive policy discussions affecting millions. The surveillance state had deeper roots than most knew. In 1945, the same year World War II ended, the U.S. government began Operation Shamrock, a program where telegraph companies, Western Union, Global, World Communications, gave the National Security Agency copies of all telegrams entering or leaving the United States. For nearly 30 years, the NSA collected and analyzed millions of private communications without warrants, in direct violation of the Communications Act of 1934. The Church Committee investigation in 1975 revealed the program's existence. Testimony showed the telegraph companies had cooperated under informal agreements, without legal compulsion or court orders. NSA analysts had access to every international telegram, creating watch lists of Americans whose communications were flagged for special attention: journalists, civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, business leaders. The program only ended when congressional investigation made it public. No telecommunications executives faced charges for facilitating illegal surveillance. No NSA officials were prosecuted for violating Americans' privacy. The legal framework supposedly protecting communications hadn't mattered when intelligence agencies decided monitoring trumped civil liberties. The surveillance evolved as technology advanced. By 2000, the FBI had deployed a system called Carnivore, a digital wiretapping tool that could monitor email traffic on internet service providers' networks. Director Louis Freeh defended the program as a narrow law enforcement tool. Documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests revealed Carnivore could actually collect far more data than the FBI claimed. Not just target emails, but all traffic flowing through the ISP, sorted later by FBI analysts. The system was installed at major ISPs without public notification. Civil liberties groups challenged the program, pointing out that its capabilities exceeded what the Fourth Amendment would permit. The FBI eventually renamed the program to something less alarming, DCS-1000, and insisted it only collected data authorized by court orders. Later reviews showed the technology allowed bulk collection first, filtering second, meaning agents had access to vast amounts of communication before any court oversight occurred. The program was officially discontinued in favor of commercial surveillance tools that did the same thing with less public relations trouble. Then, law enforcement created a shadow system to hide surveillance. Starting around 2013, the Drug Enforcement Administration's Special Operations Division used a technique called parallel construction, discovering evidence through NSA surveillance or other intelligence sources, then hiding those origins by reconstructing the investigation to look like it started. With a normal traffic stop or informant tip, Reuters investigations revealed this practice meant defendants never knew the real source of evidence against them, denying lawyers the ability to challenge surveillance legality. Court documents showed the SOD sent tips to local law enforcement with specific instructions: don't reveal where the information came from, recreate the discovery through traditional methods, testify as if you stumbled onto the evidence normally. This wasn't occasional improvisation, it was systematic policy, documented in training materials. Defense attorneys, judges, and juries were deliberately misled about how investigations began. The practice violated discovery rules requiring prosecutors to share how evidence was obtained. When exposed, DOJ officials claimed it was necessary to protect intelligence sources. The legal system's foundation, the right to challenge evidence against you, had been quietly undermined. Prosecutions based on these tainted investigations stood. The practice continued with minimal reforms. And in Vietnam, assassination became official policy. Between 1965 and 1972, the CIA's Phoenix program coordinated the systematic assassination, torture, and imprisonment of suspected Viet Cong sympathizers in South Vietnam. William Colby, who directed the program before becoming CIA director, later testified before Congress that the program had neutralized 81,740 people, killed, captured, or convinced to defect. Congressional testimony and internal reports revealed that provincial interrogation centers used torture routinely, and that many killed were civilians with no actual Viet Cong connections, targeted based on rumors or falsified intelligence. South Vietnamese officials used the program to eliminate personal enemies, business rivals, or political opponents by labeling them Viet Cong. The CIA provided training, funding, and coordination, but claimed actual operations were run by South Vietnamese forces, a legal distinction that provided deniability. When questioned by Congress in 1971, Colby admitted the program had killed between 20,000 and 40,000 people, though he insisted they were enemy combatants. The Phoenix program ended when U.S. forces withdrew from Vietnam, its assassination quotas unfilled. No Americans faced prosecution for what multiple international law experts described as systematic war crimes. The next betrayal wore a white coat and carried the authority of science. In December 1953, tobacco industry executives gathered in New York at the Plaza Hotel for what internal documents later called the most important meeting in the history of the tobacco industry. Representatives from American Tobacco, R.J. Reynolds, Philip Morris, and other major companies reviewed scientific research showing definitive links between smoking and lung cancer. Their own scientists had confirmed the findings. Instead of warning the public, the executives created the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, a PR organization designed to manufacture doubt about the science. Internal documents revealed during the 1990s Minnesota lawsuit showed the industry had known since the 1950s that cigarettes caused cancer, that nicotine was addictive, and that their marketing targeted children. For 4 decades, tobacco companies publicly denied what their internal research confirmed, spending billions on advertising and lobbying while Americans died from lung cancer at exponentially increasing rates. The 1998 Master Settlement Agreement forced companies to pay $206 billion over 25 years and release millions of pages of internal documents. No tobacco executive faced criminal charges. The lies had lasted long enough to hook generations of smokers. Earlier, another industry buried its dead workers. By the 1930s, executives at Johns Manville Corporation in Pennsylvania knew asbestos exposure caused asbestosis, a fatal lung disease. Company memos from the period, revealed in later lawsuits, showed medical directors recommending workers not be told of X-ray results showing asbestos-related disease. One internal memo stated, "The fibrosis of this disease is irreversible and permanent, so that eventually compensation will be paid to each of these men, but as long as the man has not disabled it, is felt that he should not be told of his condition so that he can live and work in peace, and the company can benefit by his many years of experience." The strategy was explicit: hide diagnoses, avoid compensation claims, extract maximum work before disability became impossible to conceal. Tens of thousands of workers died from mesothelioma and asbestosis before the dangers became public knowledge in the 1970s. Johns Manville filed for bankruptcy in 1982 to escape liability, reorganizing while victims received minimal compensation through trust funds. The bankruptcy court allowed the company to continue operating profitably while limiting payments to dying workers. The poison in America's homes was no secret to those who sold it. Through the 1920s, the Lead Industries Association in Baltimore actively suppressed research showing lead paint caused neurological damage in children. Internal studies demonstrated that children exposed to lead suffered learning disabilities, behavioral problems, and developmental delays. Industry-funded researchers were instructed to downplay findings. When independent scientists published research confirming lead's toxicity, industry groups attacked their methodology and funding. Marketing campaigns showed children in rooms painted with lead-based paint, with slogans promising durability and beauty. The industry knew. They calculated that by the time definitive proof emerged that couldn't be disputed, millions of homes would already be painted with their product, creating massive economic momentum against a ban. Lead paint wasn't prohibited for residential use until 1978, by which point multiple generations of children had suffered irreversible neurological damage. No industry executives faced prosecution. The lead stayed in the walls of older homes, requiring expensive abatement that fell on homeowners, not the manufacturers who had knowingly sold poison marketed for nurseries. Then the military created environmental catastrophe. Agent Orange, a herbicide used extensively in Vietnam between 1962 and 1971, contained dioxin, one of the most toxic substances known. Dow Chemical and Monsanto manufactured the herbicide, and internal memos later revealed both companies knew about dioxin contamination and its health effects. By 1970, Dow's own studies showed birth defects in animals exposed to dioxin. The companies shared this information with the Department of Defense but continued production. Veterans returning from Vietnam developed cancers, neurological disorders, and their children were born with severe birth defects. For years, the VA denied claims linking these illnesses to Agent Orange exposure. Dow Chemical memos from the period show executives debated whether to warn the military about contamination issues and decided against it to protect contracts. A class action lawsuit by veterans resulted in a 1984 settlement of $180 million, distributed among hundreds of thousands of claimants, working out to about $3,800 per veteran. No criminal charges were filed. The companies that manufactured a poison they knew was toxic, that caused birth defects and cancers, paid what amounted to a rounding error in their annual profits. The tragedy that preceded this had a grimmer intimacy. In 1917, young women at the U.S. Radium Corporation factory in Orange, New Jersey, painted watch dials with radium-laced luminous paint, told the material was harmless. Supervisors encouraged them to lick their brushes to maintain fine points. The women, called ghost girls because they glowed in the dark, began dying of horrific cancers, their bones literally disintegrating from radiation exposure. U.S. radium executives had evidence of radium's dangers from the beginning. The company's own scientists, who studied radiation, wore protective equipment and worked behind lead screens. The factory girls received no protection and no warnings. When women began dying in the early 1920s, company doctors falsified diagnoses, attributing deaths to syphilis to avoid liability and shame families into silence. 5 women, the Radium Girls, sued in 1928. Their lawsuit testimony, given from hospital beds as their bodies deteriorated, finally exposed the company's knowledge and deception. U.S. Radium settled to avoid trial. The factory closed in 1926, years after management knew the work was lethal. The case established the right of workers to sue employers for occupational diseases, but the women who won that right died from the exposure that proved the case. Sometimes a doctor became an unlikely hero against corporate deception. In 1960, Dr. Francis Kelsey, a new reviewer at the FDA in Cincinnati, refused to approve thalidomide for use in the United States despite intense pressure from pharmaceutical companies. The drug was already widely used in Europe as a sedative for pregnant women. Richardson Morel submitted an application claiming the drug was completely safe. Kelsey demanded more data on the drug's effects during pregnancy, citing insufficient testing. The company provided additional studies. Kelsey remained unconvinced, pointing to reports of nerve damage in long-term users. While she delayed approval, reports emerged from Europe of children born with severe limb deformities. Their mothers had taken thalidomide during pregnancy. By the time the connection was confirmed, over 10,000 children worldwide had been born with thalidomide-related birth defects. Because of Kelsey's refusal to approve the drug, only 17 American children were affected, born to mothers who received thalidomide in clinical trials. Foreign government documents later showed pharmaceutical companies had received reports of birth defects, but continued marketing the drug as safe for pregnant women. Kelsey received a Presidential Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service. The disaster she prevented by regulatory diligence became the basis for stronger drug testing requirements. But in countries where approval had been granted, tens of thousands of families lived with the consequences of corporate eagerness and regulatory failure. The pharmaceutical betrayal continued in different forms. In 1971, researchers in Boston published a study linking DES, a synthetic estrogen prescribed to pregnant women to prevent miscarriage, to a rare vaginal cancer in the daughters of women who took the drug. Pharmaceutical companies had manufactured and marketed DES since the 1940s, prescribing it to millions of pregnant women despite limited testing. Medical studies as early as 1953 had shown DES didn't actually prevent miscarriage. Yet doctors continued prescribing it for another 20 years. By the time the cancer connection was confirmed, an estimated 5 to 10 million pregnant women had taken DES. Their daughters, called DES daughters, faced increased risks of reproductive tract abnormalities, infertility, and cancer. Companies that manufactured the drug included Eli Lilly and others who had marketed it aggressively to obstetricians. Lawsuits proliferated through the 1970s and 1980s. The legal question became complex. Many women couldn't identify which company had manufactured the specific DES they took decades earlier. Courts developed new liability theories, market share liability, to address the problem. Pharmaceutical companies fought the cases viciously, settling some while others dragged through appeals. Women affected by DES continued developing cancers into the 2000s. No executives faced criminal prosecution for marketing a drug that didn't work for its intended purpose and caused cancer in the next generation. And then, there was a device sold to millions. The Dalcon Shield, an iod marketed by A.H. Robbins Company starting in 1971, was implanted in approximately 2.8 million American women based on claims it was safe and effective. Internal documents revealed during congressional hearings in 1974 showed the company knew the device's tail string, a multifilament design, could wick bacteria into the uterus, causing pelvic inflammatory disease, septic abortions, and infertility. Early reports of problems reached company executives who decided not to recall the device or warn doctors. Women suffered perforated uteruses, massive infections, and at least 18 died from septic complications. When lawsuits began mounting, A.H. Robbins mounted an aggressive legal defense, attempting to blame women's sexual behavior rather than the device's design. By the early 1980s, the company faced thousands of lawsuits. In 1985, A.H. Robbins filed for bankruptcy to limit liability. The bankruptcy created a trust fund capping payments to injured women while allowing the company to reorganize and eventually be acquired by American Home Products. Corporate officers received bonuses. Injured women received settlements averaging a few $1,000s each for injuries including sterility and life-threatening infections. The gap between corporate accountability and human cost had become a chasm formalized in bankruptcy proceedings. Now we turn to land deals that shaped a nation. In April 1922, Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall secretly leased federal oil reserves at Teapot Dome in Wyoming and Elk Hills in California to private companies without competitive bidding. Fall received about $404,000 in loans and gifts from the oil executives, cash payments, bonds, and livestock delivered to his New Mexico ranch. Senate investigators discovered the arrangement in 1923 after a rival oilman tipped off a senator about the suspicious leases. The investigation revealed Fall had leased Navy oil reserves intended for emergency military use to private companies owned by friends who had paid him handsomely for access. Fall became the first cabinet member in American history imprisoned for crimes committed while in office, serving 9 months. The oil executives who bribed him, Harry Sinclair and Edward Doheny, were acquitted in criminal trials, though the leases were voided. The Supreme Court ruled the leases had been fraudulently obtained, but by then both the oil and the money had moved. Fall went to prison. The millionaires who corrupted him went home. Teapot Dome entered American vocabulary as shorthand for government corruption. a scandal so brazen it seemed like parody. Except the federal oil was actually stolen, the secretary actually took bribes, and the system actually let the buyers walk free. Earlier, water theft built Los Angeles. Between 1905 and 1913, Los Angeles Department of Water and Power Superintendent William Mulholland orchestrated the acquisition of water rights in the Owens Valley, 200 miles north of the city. Aqueduct construction documents and land records revealed a conspiracy. City agents posed as ranchers and farmers, secretly buying land and water rights while publicly claiming Los Angeles had no designs on Owens Valley water. Mulholland worked with businessmen who bought land in the San Fernando Valley, worthless desert, until the aqueduct could deliver water. Once the aqueduct was announced, San Fernando land values exploded. Former LA Mayor Fred Eaton personally profited, having purchased key Owens Valley property earlier. The aqueduct opened in 1913, diverting the Owens River to Los Angeles. Owens Valley, once an agricultural region, became a dust bowl. Farmers who had been deceived into selling their land watched their valley die, while Los Angeles bloomed. Owens Lake dried up completely, creating toxic dust storms that continue to this day. When Owens Valley residents dynamited the aqueduct in protest during the 1920s, Los Angeles sent armed guards. The water kept flowing south. No officials faced prosecution for the fraudulent land acquisitions. The city's growth was built on stolen water, and the valley's destruction became an accepted cost of progress. But Congress had its own theft to negotiate. In September 1868, Secretary of State William Seward pushed the Alaska Purchase through Congress despite significant opposition. Congressional payment records later revealed about $165,000 of the $7.2 million purchase price went to bribing congressmen and journalists to support the treaty. Russian documents and American diplomatic correspondence showed both sides understood expenses beyond the official price would be necessary. The bribes worked, the treaty passed the Senate 37-2, and the House appropriated funds despite deep skepticism about buying frozen wilderness. Critics called it Seward's folly. Seward called it a bargain. The payments to secure approval were never officially acknowledged, surfacing only later in historical analysis of suspicious financial transfers and unusually enthusiastic newspaper coverage that appeared to have been purchased. Alaska's resources, gold, oil, strategic position, would eventually validate the purchase many times over. The bribery that secured it was quietly forgotten, folded into the narrative of American expansion. The land mattered more than how it was acquired. The railroad scandal that followed made bribery systematic. Credit Mobilier, a construction company created in 1864 to build the Union Pacific Railroad, systematically defrauded the federal government while bribing congressmen to prevent investigation. Oakes Ames, a congressman and Credit Mobilier shareholder, distributed company stock to fellow representatives at prices far below market value. Effectively bribes disguised as investment opportunities. House investigation records from 1872 revealed the scheme. Credit Mobilier, controlled by Union Pacific insiders, charged the railroad inflated prices for construction, siphoning government subsidies into private pockets. The railroad received massive federal land grants and loans. Credit Mobilier extracted that money through fraudulent billing. Congressmen received stock to ensure no oversight. When the scandal broke in 1872, investigators found Vice President Schuyler Colfax had received Credit Mobilier stock and lied about it under oath. Multiple congressmen were implicated. The House censured Ames and another congressman, but both remained in office. No criminal charges were filed. The railroad was built. The investors profited spectacularly. The pattern was established. Government subsidies plus private corruption minus accountability equals American infrastructure development. Then came a fraud that touched the presidency itself. The Whiskey Ring scandal of 1875 involved distillers and government officials who conspired to avoid federal liquor taxes, defrauding the treasury of millions. Based in St. Louis and operating across multiple cities, the ring bribed treasury officials and tax collectors to falsify production records. President Ulysses S. Grant's personal secretary, Orville Babcock, was deeply implicated. Treasury investigation documents showed he'd received regular payments and warned ring members of impending raids. Grant initially supported the prosecution, declaring, "Let no guilty man escape." But when evidence pointed to Babcock, Grant provided a deposition defending his secretary's character. Babcock was acquitted despite substantial evidence of his guilt, saved by presidential intervention. More than 100 people were indicted, and dozens convicted, but the highest-ranking figures, those closest to the president, escaped prosecution. The investigation revealed a systematic scheme involving government officials at multiple levels, operating for years while defrauding federal revenue. Grant's reputation suffered, though he claimed ignorance of his secretary's corruption. The man who had saved the Union couldn't or wouldn't see the corruption operating in his own office. Another postal fraud revealed how patronage corrupted government service. The Star Route scandal of the 1870s and 1880s involved postal contracts for mail delivery in the western United States. Stephen Dorsey, former senator from Arkansas and secretary of the Republican National Committee, organized a scheme where contractors filed low bids for postal routes, then submitted fraudulent petitions claiming routes needed upgrading, exponentially increasing payments from the government. Justice Department prosecutions in 1881 revealed the system. Contractors, postal officials, and politicians split the inflated payments while mail service actually deteriorated. The routes were called star routes because schedules were marked with asterisks and postal records. Investigation showed contractors received up to 600% increases in compensation for the same routes. 2 major trials resulted in acquittals despite evidence of fraud. Juries in Washington proved reluctant to convict well-connected defendants. The prosecutions cost more than the government recovered. The system continued, reformed only gradually through administrative changes rather than criminal accountability. Across the Atlantic, another scheme was unfolding. Swedish financier Ivar Kreuger built an empire on the global match industry in the 1920s and early 1930s, loaning money to governments in exchange for match monopolies. When his Kreuger and Toll Company collapsed in 1932, investigations revealed fraudulent accounting, forged Italian government bonds, and systematic deception of investors and banks, including Crédit Agricole in Paris. Bank collapse investigations showed Kreuger had fabricated assets worth hundreds of millions. He'd bribed government officials across Europe to secure monopoly contracts, then used those contracts as collateral for loans to finance more bribes and acquisitions. When the scheme became unsustainable during the Depression, Kreuger shot himself in Paris in March 1932. The subsequent investigation exposed the fraud's magnitude. He'd essentially operated a global Ponzi scheme disguised as a legitimate industrial empire. Investors lost approximately $250 million over $5 billion today. The scandal prompted accounting reforms, but the banks and investors who had trusted Kreuger's fabricated books absorbed massive losses. His suicide note was brief, admitting, "I'm too tired to continue." He didn't mention the thousands of investors whose savings evaporated when his fraud collapsed. And then, American banking experienced its own corruption crisis. The savings and loan scandal of the 1980s involved widespread fraud, risky lending, and regulatory failure that ultimately cost taxpayers $160 billion. Charles Keating, owner of Lincoln Savings and Loan in California, epitomized the era's corruption. Keating made risky investments with federally insured deposits, then used political connections to forestall regulatory action. Senate Ethics Committee investigation records showed he donated $1.3 million to 5 senators, the Keating Five, who pressured regulators to back off from Lincoln Savings. When the institution finally collapsed in 1989, it cost the government $3.4 billion. Keating was convicted of fraud, but served only 4.5 years before his conviction was overturned on technicalities. The 5 senators received varying degrees of reprimand, but only one lost re-election. The broader S&L crisis saw over 1,000 institutions fail due to a toxic combination of deregulation, fraud, and political interference. Executives had looted their institutions, making bad loans to friends, using deposits for personal luxury, and gambling with federally insured money. When it all collapsed, taxpayers funded the bailout, while many of the executives who'd caused the crisis walked away wealthy. Sometimes the FBI created its own criminals to catch them. In September 1980, FBI agents began an undercover operation called Abscam, posing as representatives of a fictional Arab sheikh interested in investing in America and seeking political favors. Video recordings captured in a Washington townhouse showed cash exchanging hands as congressmen and a senator promised legislative assistance. Senator Harrison Williams of New Jersey took $50,000 and stock in a titanium mine, promising to use his influence to secure government contracts. Representative Michael Myers of Pennsylvania was recorded saying money talks in this business and bullshit walks. 6 representatives and Williams were convicted. The operation's methods sparked controversy. Defense attorneys argued the FBI had invented crimes that wouldn't have occurred without government enticement. Courts ruled the evidence admissible. Myers became the first congressman expelled from the House since the Civil War. Williams resigned from the Senate rather than face expulsion. The conviction stood, but the question lingered. Had the FBI uncovered corruption or manufactured it? The answer seemed to be both. The officials had taken the bribe, but the bribe wouldn't have existed without FBI creativity. Either way, video of congressmen stuffing cash in their pockets became permanent evidence of how easily some officials could be purchased. Earlier, influence had been sold more quietly. Through the mid-1970s, South Korean intelligence operative Tong-sun Park distributed hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash and gifts to members of Congress to influence U.S. policy toward Korea. The House Ethics Committee investigation in 1976-77 documented Koreagate, a systematic campaign of bribery involving congressional trips, cash payments, and lavish parties. Park had cultivated relationships with dozens of congressmen, particularly those on committees dealing with foreign affairs and military aid. He operated with the knowledge and support of the Korean CIA, essentially running a foreign government's bribery operation on Capitol Hill. When the scandal broke, Park initially fled to Korea. He eventually returned to testify under immunity, admitting he'd delivered cash directly to congressmen's offices and homes. 3 congressmen were reprimanded. 1 was censured. None were criminally prosecuted. Park himself faced no U.S. charges due to his immunity agreement. The investigation revealed how easily foreign governments could purchase influence in Congress and how difficult it was to hold anyone accountable when the bribes crossed international borders. The systematic corruption was documented, acknowledged, and minimally punished. Which brings us to savings and loans again. 5 U.S. senators intervened with federal regulators on behalf of Charles Keating's Lincoln Savings and Loan in 1987. Shortly before it collapsed in spectacular fraud. The Keating Five, Alan Cranston, Dennis DeConcini, John Glenn, John McCain, and Donald Regal, met with banking regulators to discuss the investigation into Lincoln Savings. Senate Ethics Committee hearings in 1991 revealed all 5 had received substantial campaign contributions from Keating, totaling $1.3 million. McCain later acknowledged the meetings were inappropriate, calling his involvement the worst mistake of my life. The Ethics Committee found Cranston had violated Senate rules and reprimanded him. The other 4 received lesser findings, poor judgment, but not rule violations. None faced criminal charges. Keating himself was convicted of fraud and served 4.5 years. The senators' careers largely continued. McCain became a presidential candidate and leading voice on campaign finance reform, using his own scandal as evidence the system needed fixing. The irony was precise. Participation in corruption became credentials for reforming it. The senators had used their influence on behalf of a criminal in exchange for donations. The corruption was documented and televised, and the consequence was reprimands that barely registered in their careers. The next corruption came with business cards. Jack Abramoff, a Washington lobbyist, operated a systematic bribery scheme through the early 2000s, bribing congressmen to support legislation benefiting his clients. Department of Justice prosecution documents showed Abramoff treated congressional offices like a market, offering golf trips to Scotland, luxury skybox seats, expensive meals, and cash to officials' family members. Representative Bob Ney of Ohio received trips and tickets, then used congressional procedures to insert favorable provisions into legislation. When the investigation caught Abramoff, he cooperated extensively, providing evidence against multiple congressmen and staffers. Ney pleaded guilty to conspiracy and making false statements, serving 17 months in prison. Abramoff himself served 3.5 years. At least 21 people, including congressional staffers and executive branch officials, were convicted in the sprawling investigation. The scandal revealed the mechanics of modern Washington corruption. Lawmakers traded official actions for golf trips and dinner reservations. Lobbyists documented their bribes as legitimate expenses. And the system continued until prosecutors happened to investigate one particularly brazen operator. The convictions were real. The system that enabled the corruption remained largely intact. Then came bribery with a literal price list. Representative Randy Duke Cunningham of California resigned in 2005 after pleading guilty to accepting $2.4 million in bribes from defense contractors in exchange for steering government contracts their way. Search warrant documents revealed Cunningham had kept a bribe menu, a handwritten card listing how much contractors needed to pay for contracts of different values. For every $1 million in contract value, Cunningham demanded $50,000 plus perks. Contractors bought him a Rolls-Royce, paid for his daughter's graduation party, covered his mortgage, and purchased his house at inflated prices. In return, Cunningham used his position on the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee to insert earmarks funding his benefactors' companies. The scheme was systematic, documented, and brazen. Cunningham served 8 years in federal prison, the longest sentence for congressional corruption at that time. The contractors who bribed him also went to prison. The case was unusual precisely because the corruption was so well documented and the consequences actually matched the crime. Cunningham's bribe menu became shorthand for explicit congressional corruption. A pricing list for government favors rendered in handwriting on an index card. Illinois elevated corruption to art form. On December 9, 2008, FBI agents arrested Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich at his Chicago home after wiretaps recorded him discussing selling President-elect Barack Obama's vacant Senate seat. The tapes captured Blagojevich saying the Senate seat was fucking golden, and he wasn't giving it up for fucking nothing. Federal trial transcripts documented weeks of conversations about what he could extract in exchange for appointing someone to the seat. A cabinet position, campaign contributions, a high-paying job for his wife. The audacity wasn't that he wanted to profit from his appointment power, that was standard corruption. The audacity was doing it on phone lines he knew might be monitored, discussing bribery so explicitly it sounded like parody. Blagojevich was convicted on 17 counts and sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. He served 8 before President Trump commuted his sentence in 2020. Throughout his trial and imprisonment, Blagojevich maintained he'd done nothing wrong, that politicians discussing political favors was normal business. He wasn't entirely wrong, he'd just been too explicit about the transaction. The tapes revealed what usually stayed unspoken, and that explicitness became his crime. Virginia's governor learned corruption required more subtlety. Former Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell and his wife were convicted in 2014 of accepting $177,000 in loans and gifts from businessman Johnny Williams in exchange for promoting his dietary supplements company. Corruption trial testimony showed the McDonnells received a Rolex watch, designer clothing, golf outings, and $15,000 for their daughter's wedding catering. In return, McDonnell hosted events at the governor's mansion promoting Williams' products, arranged meetings with state health officials, and helped the company seek research funding from state universities. The defense argued no official act was provably linked to any specific gift. McDonnell had simply been friendly to a donor, which was normal politics. A jury convicted both McDonnells. Then the Supreme Court unanimously overturned the convictions in 2016, ruling the definition of official act was too broad. The court held that arranging meetings and hosting events didn't constitute official acts that could be traded for gifts. The decision essentially narrowed federal bribery law, making it harder to prosecute corruption unless a specific governmental action, like voting on a bill or awarding a contract, could be tied directly to a benefit. The McDonnells went free. The gifts didn't get returned. The ruling made clear that politicians could accept substantial benefits as long as they avoided explicit quid pro quo, creating a blueprint for legal corruption. And then there was the Speaker's secret. Dennis Hastert, former Speaker of the House, was sentenced in 2016 to 15 months in federal prison for structuring bank withdrawals to evade reporting requirements. The money was hush money. $3.5 million Hastert had agreed to pay someone from his past to keep quiet about misconduct when Hastert was a high school wrestling coach. Federal prosecutors couldn't charge Hastert with the underlying misconduct due to statutes of limitations, but court documents revealed he'd engaged in sexual misconduct with students decades earlier. The bank fraud case exposed what Hastert had been hiding: abuse of minors under his authority as a coach and teacher. At sentencing, a federal judge called Hastert a serial child molester. He served 13 months. The man who had been second in line to the presidency, who had presented himself as a moral authority during the Clinton impeachment, had been a child abuser, paying millions to prevent exposure. The money he withdrew illegally was evidence of crimes prosecutors couldn't charge. The cover-up became the prosecutable offense, while the underlying harm remained beyond legal reach. The gap between public respectability and private criminality had been decades wide. By now you've heard deals that sound impossible. If one of these has surprised you tonight, drop a comment. Which revelation caught you off guard? What the public never saw required unprecedented secrecy. In 1943, in the desert near Los Alamos, New Mexico, General Leslie Groves oversaw the Manhattan Project, employing 120,000 people across multiple sites to build an atomic bomb. Restricted documents later revealed the scale of secrecy. Entire cities built in remote areas. Workers performing specialized tasks without knowing the project's purpose. Security so tight that Vice President Harry Truman didn't learn of the bomb's existence until after Roosevelt's death. Workers at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, enriched uranium without being told what they were producing. Engineers at Hanford, Washington, built plutonium reactors while prohibited from discussing their work even with colleagues at the same facility. Groves compartmentalized information ruthlessly. Scientists knew their specific piece, but rarely the whole picture. The operation cost $2 billion, over $30 billion today, employed tens of thousands, and remained hidden from Congress, the press, and the American public until August 1945, when atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The secret wasn't kept through a small conspiracy, it was kept through bureaucratic control, geographic isolation, and a system where workers knew asking questions meant losing clearance. The atomic age began with the largest secret ever kept in American democracy, proof that vast operations could be hidden when institutional power decided transparency threatened national interest. Then military planning turned to catastrophic miscalculation. In April 1961, the CIA launched an invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, using Cuban exiles the agency had trained and equipped. Richard Bissell, CIA Deputy Director for Plans, had assured President Kennedy the operation would succeed, triggering an uprising against Castro. CIA internal review documents later revealed the planning had been delusional. Analysts who questioned the plan's viability were excluded from decision-making. Intelligence suggesting Castro had consolidated power was ignored. And operational security was so poor that Cuban intelligence knew the invasion was coming. The 1,400 exiles landed and were immediately pinned down by Castro's forces. No uprising occurred. Kennedy refused to provide U.S. air support that might have salvaged the operation, not wanting overt American military involvement. Within 3 days, most of the exile force was captured or killed. The post-operation review was damning. The CIA had sold the president a fantasy, ignored contrary evidence, and created a disaster that strengthened Castro while embarrassing the United States. Kennedy later said privately he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. He settled for replacing some leadership. The failure was so complete it should have triggered fundamental reform. Instead, the agency learned to be more careful about what promises it made presidents. Years later, an attack on an American ship raised questions never fully answered. On June 8, 1967, during the Six-Day War, Israeli aircraft and torpedo boats attacked the US Liberty, a Navy intelligence ship in international waters off the Sinai Peninsula. The attack killed 34 American sailors and injured 171. Israeli forces claimed they'd mistaken the Liberty for an Egyptian vessel, apologizing and paying compensation. But a Navy court of inquiry and subsequent investigations revealed troubling details. The Liberty was clearly marked with American flags. The attack lasted over 2 hours with multiple strafing runs. Israeli aircraft had circled the ship beforehand, and survivors reported the attackers had jammed. Distress frequencies. Declassified NSA intercepts showed Israeli pilots questioning whether the ship was American before being ordered to attack anyway. The official explanation, mistaken identity, contradicted substantial evidence. Survivors and some investigators believed the attack was deliberate, possibly because the Liberty had intercepted communications Israel wanted hidden. The Johnson administration accepted Israel's explanation and ordered the Navy to conclude its investigation quickly. Survivors were warned not to discuss the incident publicly. For decades, crew members were threatened with court-martial if they spoke about what they'd witnessed. The attack remained officially an accident despite testimony, intercepts, and circumstances suggesting otherwise. The truth was sacrificed to geopolitical alliance. The following year brought another naval incident with lasting consequences. On January 23, 1968, North Korean forces seized the Us Pueblo, a Navy intelligence ship operating in international waters, capturing the crew and holding them for 11 months. Commander Lloyd Booker and his 82 crew members endured beatings, mock executions, and psychological torture before being released. Congressional inquiry afterward focused on why Booker had surrendered the ship without fighting, the first U.S. Navy vessel captured in peacetime in over 150 years. Booker testified he'd been under-equipped to resist, that his classified material couldn't be destroyed quickly enough, and that fighting would have resulted in his crew's massacre. The Navy recommended court-martial. The Secretary of the Navy declined to prosecute, stating the crew had suffered enough. The real questions were never satisfactorily answered. Why was an intelligence ship operating in hostile waters with inadequate defenses? Why didn't military command authorize rescue or retaliation? The Pueblo remained in North Korean hands, eventually becoming a museum in Pyongyang. The crew came home to controversy about whether they'd been cowards or victims of command failure. The inquiry blamed the captain for surrendering, but absolved the system that sent an unarmed intelligence ship into dangerous waters. 2 decades forward, Another October brought whispered conspiracy. Allegations emerged in the 1980s that Ronald Reagan's campaign had made a deal with Iran to delay releasing American hostages until after the 1980 election, denying President Carter a potential victory, clinching October surprise. Congressional investigations in 1992-93 examined claims that William Casey, Reagan's campaign director, had met with Iranian officials in Paris in October 1980 to negotiate the delay. Witnesses provided contradictory testimony. Documents were ambiguous. The investigation couldn't definitively prove the conspiracy occurred, but couldn't disprove it either. What was confirmed? Iran released the hostages on January 20, 1981, minutes after Reagan was inaugurated, timing that seemed almost deliberately theatrical. Arms sales to Iran began shortly after, eventually becoming the Iran-Contra scandal. Whether this represented a secret deal or convenient coincidence remained unresolved. The investigation concluded there was no credible evidence of the alleged conspiracy, but enough circumstantial questions persisted that the theory never fully died. Sometimes the absence of proof and the presence of suspicious timing create permanent doubt. The military's next scandal involved its own officers' conduct. In September 1991, Navy and Marine aviators gathered at the Las Vegas Hilton for the Tailhook Association Symposium. What followed was documented in a Pentagon Inspector General report. 83 women and 7 men were sexually assaulted during a gauntlet in the hotel's third-floor hallway where intoxicated officers groped anyone who passed. Lieutenant Paula Coughlin, one of the victims, filed a formal complaint that triggered investigation. The IG report detailed systematic assault, destruction of evidence, and a culture that tolerated sexual harassment as normal behavior. When the scandal became public, multiple admirals resigned or were censured. The Navy's initial investigation was found to be inadequate. Leaders had minimized the misconduct, failed to identify perpetrators, and tried to contain the damage rather than pursue accountability. A second investigation led to discipline for over 300 officers, though most punishments were administrative rather than criminal. No officer was court-martialed specifically for assault at Tailhook. The scandal forced the Navy to confront its culture, leading to reforms in how sexual assault was handled. But the gap between the documented assaults and the minimal criminal consequences demonstrated how institutions protect their own even when the evidence is overwhelming. Then the military lied to a family about how their son died. Army Ranger Pat Tillman, who'd left an NFL career to enlist after 9/11, was killed in Afghanistan on April 22, 2004. The Army initially reported he died heroically in combat with enemy forces, awarding him a Silver Star and Purple Heart. His family received those medals at a memorial service where speakers praised his sacrifice in battle. The truth emerged weeks later through the persistence of Tillman's family and press investigation. He'd been killed by friendly fire, shot by his own unit in confusion during an ambush. Army investigations revealed officers knew within hours that Tillman had died from friendly fire, but approved a false narrative anyway. Congressional hearings in 2007 brought testimony showing the cover-up extended to the highest levels of military command. Documents were destroyed. The soldiers who shot Tillman were ordered not to tell his family the truth. The Army used Tillman's death for propaganda value while lying about how he died. His mother testified before Congress about being lied to by officials who knew the truth. Several officers received administrative punishment. None faced criminal charges. The deliberate deception of a family about their son's death, for public relations purposes, was officially acknowledged as wrong. But prosecuting the deceivers apparently threatened military cohesion more than the lies threatened integrity. And then photographs exposed what official denials had hidden. In April 2004, CBS News broadcast photographs from Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, showing American soldiers torturing and humiliating Iraqi detainees. The images, prisoners forced into stress positions, threatened with dogs, subjected to sexual humiliation, stacked naked in pyramids while soldiers smiled for the camera, shocked the world. Military tribunal records revealed Specialist Charles Grainer and others had systematically abused prisoners for months. The Bush administration initially characterized the abuse as the actions of a few low-ranking soldiers. But subsequent investigations, including the Taguba Report and Senate Armed Services Committee inquiry, documented that interrogation techniques approved at the highest levels of Defense Department had created the conditions for abuse. Memos from Justice Department lawyers had authorized enhanced interrogation that skirted torture definitions. Senior officers had known about abuse and failed to stop it. Grainer and 10 other low-ranking soldiers were convicted and imprisoned. No general officers were court-martialed. No senior Bush administration officials faced prosecution. The photographs documented systematic abuse occurring in an American-run prison, authorized by legal memos redefining torture, supervised by officers who avoided accountability. The soldiers who carried out the abuse went to prison. The system that ordered it remained intact. When senators finally assembled to investigate, the revelations were stunning. In January 1975, Senator Frank Church convened hearings investigating intelligence agency abuses, exposing CIA assassination plots, illegal domestic surveillance, and mind control experiments. Church committee testimony brought to light programs Americans had been told didn't exist, CIA attempts to assassinate foreign leaders including Fidel Castro, the FBI's harassment of Martin Luther King Jr., NSA interception of millions of private communications, and the full scope of MKUltra. Witnesses described administering LSD to unwitting subjects, opening citizens' mail without warrants, and infiltrating peaceful political organizations. The Senate hearings were televised, documents were declassified, the institutional criminality was laid bare. The committee's final reports recommended reforms, oversight committees, restrictions on domestic surveillance, prohibitions on assassination. Some recommendations became law. The Intelligence Oversight Act of 1976 created congressional committees to monitor intelligence activities. But the fundamental structure remained unchanged. No CIA directors were prosecuted. No FBI leaders faced criminal charges. The reforms were administrative, new committees, new procedures, new rules that would apply until the next crisis when exceptions would be justified. The exposure was real. The accountability was theatrical. Simultaneously, a parallel investigation was being suppressed. The Pike Committee, chaired by Representative Otis Pike, conducted its own investigation of intelligence agencies from February to December 1975. House investigation documents revealed the CIA had spent billions on covert operations that failed. Intelligence estimates had been deliberately distorted to support policy preferences, and the agency had withheld information from Congress routinely. Pike's committee was more aggressive than Church's, demanding detailed budget information and operational records. The CIA fought the investigation viciously, claiming national security required secrecy. The House voted to suppress the Pike Committee's final report, preventing its official publication. Daniel Shore of CBS News obtained a copy and provided it to the Village Voice, which published it in February 1976. The report documented waste, failure, and systematic deception of Congress by intelligence agencies. Unlike the Church Committee's recommendations, which led to some reforms, the Pike Committee's work was buried by the same institution that commissioned it. The investigation that dug too deep into intelligence budgets and operational failures was silenced. The one that focused on abuses while leaving structure intact was allowed to proceed. The lesson was clear. Congress would tolerate exposure of past excesses, but not fundamental challenges to intelligence agency power. A decade later, televised hearings captivated the nation again. In May 1987, joint congressional hearings began investigating the Iran-Contra affair. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, wearing his Marine uniform and medals, testified under immunity about selling weapons to Iran and diverting profits to Nicaraguan Contras. National Security Advisor John Poindexter testified he'd authorized the operations and deliberately kept President Reagan uninformed to provide deniability. The televised testimony was remarkable. Administration officials calmly describing systematic violation of congressional restrictions, document destruction, creation of a secret foreign policy, and lies to Congress, all presented as patriotic duty. North became a folk hero to some viewers, portrayed as a loyal soldier following orders. The Tower Commission report documented the scope of the operations, secret arms sales, illegal funding of the Contras, false statements to Congress, shredded documents. Criminal prosecutions followed. North was convicted on 3 felony counts. Poindexter was convicted on 5. Then, appeals courts vacated both convictions because they'd testified under immunity, and prosecutors couldn't prove they hadn't used immunized testimony. Both went free. The lesson repeated: congressional testimony under immunity could expose crimes while simultaneously preventing prosecution for those crimes. The system traded truth for accountability, getting revelations while abandoning consequences. Banking corruption demanded its own investigation. In 1992, Senator John Kerry led the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee investigation into Peachy's collapse. The Banking Committee report documented how regulators in the U.S., UK, and elsewhere had ignored warnings about Peachy for years, while the bank facilitated drug money laundering, terrorism financing, and systematic fraud. Federal regulators had evidence Peachy was criminally operated as early as 1985, but failed to act decisively until 1991. The investigation revealed the bank had bribed officials, manipulated political processes, and operated with impunity because it was useful to intelligence agencies and politically connected. Clark Clifford, the respected Democratic elder statesman who'd served 4 presidents, was indicted for his role in Beakey's illegal acquisition of First American Bank. The charges were eventually dropped due to Clifford's health. Robert Altman, his law partner, was acquitted. The investigation laid bare systematic regulatory failure. Agencies that should have shut Peachy down years earlier had allowed it to continue operating, defrauding depositors and facilitating crime. Kerry's report used phrases like corporate crime on a global scale and documented how the bank had infiltrated political and financial systems worldwide. But most Peachy executives fled to countries without extradition. The bank's political protectors faced no consequences. The regulatory failures that enabled the fraud led to no firings or prosecutions of the regulators themselves. Arkansas land deals somehow led to a presidency's impeachment crisis. The Whitewater investigation, launched in 1994, began as a probe into Bill and Hillary Clinton's investment in an Arkansas land development that lost money in the 1970s and 1980s. Independent counsel Kenneth Starr's investigation expanded far beyond the original real estate questions. What started as examining whether the Clintons received improper benefits from a failing savings and loan became a sprawling investigation into their finances. The death of White House Deputy Counsel Vince Foster, the firing of White House Travel Office employees, and eventually Monica Lewinsky. The investigation lasted 4 years, cost over $70 million, and produced 11 convictions of people in the Clintons' orbit, but no charges against the Clintons themselves regarding Whitewater. The Lewinsky matter, which emerged from Starr's expanded mandate, led to Clinton's impeachment for perjury and obstruction of justice. The Senate acquitted him. The investigation demonstrated how independent counsels with unlimited time and resources could pursue targets until finding something prosecutable, even if unrelated to the original inquiry. It also showed that presidential investigations had become partisan weapons. Starr was appointed by a Republican panel, investigating a Democratic president, with the investigation's scope expanding to encompass anything potentially damaging. The original Whitewater questions were never definitively answered. They'd long since been overshadowed by a sex scandal that had nothing to do with Arkansas real estate. Then came an investigation into how America failed to prevent catastrophe. The 9/11 Commission, established in 2002, investigated the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. The Commission's final report, released in 2004, documented intelligence failures, communication breakdowns between agencies, and warning signs that were missed or ignored. Chairman Thomas Keane and Vice Chairman Lee Hamilton led a bipartisan investigation that held public hearings, interviewed over 1,200 people, and reviewed millions of documents. The report concluded that the attacks were preventable if agencies had shared information effectively and acted on available intelligence. It made recommendations: reorganize intelligence agencies, create a director of national intelligence, improve information sharing, enhance border security. Some recommendations were implemented, the Dini position was created, intelligence structures were reorganized, but key questions remained unanswered or inadequately addressed. Why were air defenses so ineffective? What explained the collapse of Building 7, which wasn't hit by a plane? Why was evidence from Ground Zero removed so quickly? Family members of victims who pressed for deeper investigation felt the commission had been too constrained by political pressure to avoid embarrassing either the Bush or Clinton administrations. The report acknowledged failures but attributed them to systemic problems rather than individual culpability. No officials lost their jobs over missing the warnings. No one faced prosecution for the intelligence failures. The commission produced a narrative of what happened and why it shouldn't happen again. But the accountability for it having happened was diffused into systemic failure. Years later, financial catastrophe demanded explanation. The Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, established in 2009, investigated the causes of the 2008 financial crisis. Phil Angelides chaired the commission, examining how mortgage-backed securities, deregulation, and excessive risk-taking by financial institutions had brought the global economy to the brink of collapse. The Commission's 2011 report found the crisis was avoidable, caused by widespread failures in financial regulation and supervision, dramatic failures of corporate governance, excessive borrowing and risk-taking, and systemic breaches in accountability and ethics. The investigation documented how banks had issued mortgages to borrowers who couldn't afford them, packaged those mortgages into securities rated as safe when they were toxic, and bet against the very securities they were selling to clients. The Federal Reserve and other regulators had the authority to stop predatory lending, but didn't use it. Credit rating agencies gave AAA ratings to securities that would soon be worthless. The crisis destroyed $19 trillion in household wealth and triggered the worst recession since the 1930s. The Commission's findings were clear and damning. The prosecutions were minimal. No major Wall Street executives went to prison. Banks paid civil settlements, fines that amounted to fractions of the profits they'd made and the damage they'd caused. Attorney General Eric Holder later admitted the Justice Department had been concerned that prosecuting major banks might destabilize the financial system. The institutions were too big to fail, and their leaders were too important to jail. And then the torture program received its official accounting. In December 2014, the Senate Intelligence Committee released a 525-page summary of its 6,700-page report on CIA torture. Senator Dianne Feinstein had led a 5-year investigation that reviewed millions of pages of classified CIA documents. The report concluded that enhanced interrogation techniques were far more brutal than the agency had represented, that the torture produced little useful intelligence, and that the CIA had repeatedly lied to Congress, the White House, and the public about the program's effectiveness. The techniques included waterboarding prisoners dozens of times, keeping them in coffin-sized boxes for hours, forcing them to stand on broken legs, and rectal feeding that served no medical purpose. Detainees had been subjected to sleep deprivation for up to 180 hours, sometimes standing, chained to walls. At least one detainee froze to death after being left overnight chained to a concrete floor in a secret prison. The CIA destroyed videotapes of interrogations, withheld information from the Justice Department lawyers providing legal cover for the program, and misrepresented the intelligence gained to justify continuing the torture. When the summary was finally released, most of the 6,700-page report remained classified. No CIA officials faced prosecution. The Justice Department had already declined to bring charges. The exposure was comprehensive. The accountability was non-existent. When witnesses swore to tell the truth, sometimes the truth destroyed careers. The immunity Oliver North received changed everything. In July 1987, Marine Lieutenant Colonel North sat before Congress wearing his uniform heavy with decorations. His lawyer, Brendan Sullivan, beside him. North testified under immunity about running illegal arms sales to Iran and funneling money to Contras, describing the operations with military precision and unwavering confidence that he'd been following orders. The testimony was remarkable. A mid-level officer, calmly detailing systematic violation of congressional law, presented his patriotism. He was convicted in 1989 on 3 felony counts: aiding and abetting obstruction of Congress, shredding documents, and accepting an illegal gratuity. Then, in 1990, an appeals court vacated all convictions. The reason? Prosecutors couldn't prove they hadn't used his immunized testimony to build their case. North walked free, later launching a radio career and becoming a political commentator. The immunity that compelled his truthfulness also guaranteed his freedom. But sometimes testimony actually ended presidencies. In June 1973, White House counsel John Dean sat before the Senate Watergate Committee and systematically dismantled Richard Nixon's presidency. Dean had been Nixon's lawyer, privy to conversations about the cover-up, payments to burglars, and obstruction of the FBI investigation. His testimony was detailed, precise, and devastating. I began by telling the president that there was a cancer growing on the presidency, and that if the cancer was not removed, the president himself would be killed by it. Dean described meeting after meeting where Nixon and his closest advisors discussed how to contain the scandal, how much to pay the burglars to stay quiet, how to use the CIA to block the FBI. The Senate chamber was packed. Television cameras broadcast every word. Dean's photographic memory for conversations proved accurate when the White House tapes were finally released, confirming his testimony almost verbatim. He pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice, served 4 months in prison, and watched from prison as his testimony contributed to Nixon's resignation in August 1974. The lawyer who broke attorney-client privilege to tell the truth paid a price, but the president he exposed paid more. Years later, another testimony riveted the nation, but changed nothing. On October 11, 1991, University of Oklahoma law professor Anita Hill testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee about sexual harassment by Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas. Hill, who had worked for Thomas at the Department of Education and the EOC, described in careful, uncomfortable detail his repeated discussions of pornography, his comments about her appearance, and his graphic sexual remarks. She testified calmly, precisely, reluctantly, a law professor who clearly wished she didn't have to be there. Thomas denied everything, calling the hearing a high-tech lynching. The all-male Senate Judiciary Committee questioned Hill skeptically, with some senators openly hostile. Senator Arlen Specter accused her of flat-out perjury. The nation watched, divided. Polls showed most Americans believed Thomas. The Senate confirmed him 52-48, one of the closest Supreme Court votes in history. Hill returned to teaching, her career damaged by speaking up. Thomas joined the court, where he remains decades later. The testimony that should have ended a nomination instead became a case study in how institutions protect their preferred outcomes regardless of what witnesses say under oath. Then came testimony that exposed a detective's racism. In March 1995, lab detective Mark Furman testified in the O.J. Simpson murder trial that he had never used racial slurs, specifically the N-word. Months later, defense attorneys produced audio tapes of Furman using the word repeatedly, 41 times on the recordings, while also describing planting evidence and beating suspects. The tapes, recorded by a screenwriter interviewing Furman for a project, captured him boasting about police brutality and evidence tampering. When recalled to the stand, Fuhrman invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination when asked if he'd planted evidence in Simpson's case. He was later charged with perjury for his testimony denying use of racial slurs. He pleaded no contest, received 3 years probation and a $200 fine. The perjury was documented, recorded, undeniable. The penalty was a misdemeanor and probation. Simpson was acquitted, with Fuhrman's credibility destruction playing a significant role in the defense strategy. The detective who'd lied under oath about his racism faced minimal consequences, while his testimony helped free a man most evidence suggested was guilty. The next confession came from a grand jury room. In August 1998, Monica Lewinsky testified before a grand jury about her relationship with President Bill Clinton, receiving immunity in exchange for truthful testimony. Her detailed account of the affair, the gifts exchanged, and Clinton's request that she lie about it formed the basis of independent counsel Ken Starr's referral to Congress. Clinton had testified in January 1998 that I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. Lewinsky's grand jury testimony, along with phone recordings made by her former friend Linda Tripp, proved Clinton had lied under oath. The House impeached Clinton in December 1998 on charges of perjury and obstruction of justice. The Senate acquitted him in February 1999, with neither charge receiving even a simple majority, let alone the 2/3 required for removal. Lewinsky's truthful testimony had been compelled through immunity. Clinton's lies had been documented through investigation. He remained president, later disbarred in Arkansas and by the Supreme Court, but served out his term with high approval ratings. The intern who told the truth became a punchline. The president who lied remained in office. Corporate executives learned truth-telling had its limits too. In February 2002, Enron executives testified before Congress about the company's collapse, which had destroyed $74 billion in shareholder value and wiped out employees' retirement savings. Chairman Kenneth Lay appeared, flanked by lawyers, invoking his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, rather than answering questions. CEO Jeffrey Skilling testified, claiming he knew nothing about the accounting fraud that had inflated Enron's value while hiding billions in debt. The company had collapsed in weeks once the fraud was exposed, using off-books partnerships and mark-to-market accounting to create the illusion of profitability. Congressional hearing transcripts show Skilling claiming the accounting had been approved by Arthur Andersen and legal. Lay eventually stood trial, was convicted on 10 counts of fraud and conspiracy in May 2006, and died of a heart attack in July before sentencing. His conviction was vacated due to his death. Skilling received 24 years, later reduced to 14. The executives who'd built a house of cards using accounting tricks destroyed thousands of lives. Most served reduced sentences or none at all. The employees and investors who lost everything got neither their money nor meaningful justice. Then Wall Street executives testified without consequences. In April 2010, Goldman Sachs executives, including CEO Lloyd Blankfein, testified before the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations about the bank's role in the financial crisis. Senators presented emails showing Goldman had bet against the very mortgage securities it was selling to clients, essentially selling investments they knew were garbage, while profiting when those investments failed. Blankfein defended the practice as market making, providing liquidity. Senator Carl Levin read aloud emails where Goldman employees called the securities junk and crap while marketing them to investors. The hearing revealed Goldman had made billions betting against the housing market while telling clients to buy mortgage-backed securities. No criminal charges followed. The SEC brought a civil case, which Goldman settled for $550 million, a fraction of the profits they'd made. The executives kept their jobs, their bonuses, their reputations in most circles. The testimony documented everything: the knowledge, the deception, the profits from others' losses. The consequence was a settlement that amounted to a cost of doing business. Most recently, tech executives faced similar theater. On April 10, 2018, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg testified before the Senate Commerce and Judiciary Committees about Cambridge Analytica's harvesting of 87 million users' data without consent. Whistleblower Christopher Wiley had revealed the data breach publicly, explaining how Cambridge Analytica had obtained Facebook data to build psychological profiles for political targeting. Zuckerberg apologized, called it a breach of trust, and promised reforms. Senators asked questions that revealed many didn't understand how Facebook's business model worked. The hearing lasted hours but produced no legislation, no regulatory framework, no meaningful consequences. The FTC eventually fined Facebook $5 billion, the largest privacy fine in history, but approximately 9% of Facebook's annual revenue, and less than the company made in a single quarter. Cambridge Analytica shut down, but Facebook's data collection practices continued largely unchanged. The platform that had enabled the largest data privacy breach in history emerged with its business model intact and its executives unpunished. Sometimes the most damning evidence came in paper form. The Pentagon Papers leaked in 1971 weren't just documents, they were 7,000 pages of institutional deception. When the New York Times published the first excerpt in June, the Nixon administration immediately sought an injunction, arguing national security. The documents themselves, compiled by defense analyst Daniel Ellsberg and formally titled United States, Vietnam Relations, 1945-1967, a study prepared by the Department of Defense, revealed that 4 consecutive administrations had systematically lied about the war. President Johnson had planned escalation while campaigning as the peace candidate. The Gulf of Tonkin incident had been known to be questionable from the start. The government had never believed the war was winnable, but continued fighting anyway, spending lives while knowing the strategy was futile. The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that the Times could publish. Prior restraint violated the First Amendment. Nixon's fury about the leak led to creating the Plumbers Unit, which would burglarize Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office seeking dirt and eventually break into the Watergate. The documents exposed decades of lies. The attempt to suppress them brought down a presidency. Then came recordings that proved conspiracy at the highest level. The existence of White House taping systems was revealed almost accidentally in July 1973 when Alexander Butterfield, a former White House aide, testified before the Senate Watergate Committee that Nixon had recording devices in the Oval Office. The revelation changed everything. Suddenly there was proof of what Nixon knew, and when he knew it. Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox subpoenaed the tapes. Nixon refused, citing executive privilege. The Saturday Night Massacre followed. Nixon ordered Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire Cox. Richardson resigned rather than comply. Deputy Ag William Ruckelshaus also resigned. Solicitor General Robert Bork finally fired Cox. Public outcry was immediate. Eventually, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously in United States v. Nixon that the president had to surrender the tapes. The smoking gun tape from June 23, 1972, recorded Nixon approving use of the CIA to block the FBI's Watergate investigation. 3 days after that tape's release, facing certain impeachment, Nixon resigned. The tapes he'd made to preserve his legacy instead documented his crimes in his own voice. Evidence destruction became its own scandal. In November 1986, as the Iran-Contra scandal was breaking, National Security Council Secretary Fawn Hall helped Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North shred documents in his White House office. Hall later testified she'd altered and destroyed official records, smuggling some documents out of the White House in her clothing. The documents detailed arms sales to Iran and the diversion of funds to Nicaraguan Contras. Many were destroyed before investigators could secure them. North's memo detailing the operation, which would have proven Reagan's knowledge, was among those shredded. The Tower Commission investigating Iran-Contra noted the extensive destruction of documents that would have clarified whether President Reagan had authorized the operations. Reagan testified he couldn't recall. His written answers to questions used variations of "I don't remember" or "I don't recall" 88 times. The document destruction guaranteed ambiguity. Without paper proof, memories could fail. Hall received immunity for her testimony. North's convictions were vacated. The missing memos stayed missing, and uncertainty about presidential knowledge became permanent. But sometimes industry documents survive to tell the truth. In 1994, a paralegal named Morrell Williams leaked thousands of pages of internal Brown & Williamson tobacco documents to plaintiffs' attorneys and media. The documents, which Williams had secretly copied while working at a law firm defending the tobacco company, proved tobacco executives had known for decades that cigarettes caused cancer and that nicotine was addictive, while publicly denying both. One executive had written in an internal memo, "We are in the business of selling nicotine, an addictive drug." The document showed companies had researched making safer cigarettes, but abandoned the projects fearing it would acknowledge existing products were dangerous. Minnesota's lawsuit against the tobacco industry obtained millions more pages through discovery. The documents revealed research into marketing to children, manipulation of nicotine levels to maintain addiction, and decades of coordinated deception. The revelations led to the 1998 Master Settlement Agreement, requiring tobacco companies to pay states $206 billion over 25 years. Williams faced legal threats for years. The industry fought to suppress the documents, but once public, they demonstrated beyond doubt that tobacco companies had knowingly killed their customers while lying about it. Energy market manipulation got documented too. In 2002, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission released thousands of Enron emails and memos, showing how the company had deliberately manipulated California's electricity market. The emails revealed traders joking about stealing money from Grandma Millie in California, scheduling unnecessary plant shutdowns to create artificial scarcity, and moving energy out of state during peak demand to drive up prices. Transcripts showed traders celebrating as wildfires forced power line shutdowns. Burn, baby, burn. The scheme had caused rolling blackouts across California in 2000-2001, forced one utility into bankruptcy, and cost California an estimated $40 billion. The emails documented the manipulation explicitly, traders coordinating schemes with code names like Death Star and Fat Boy to game the deregulated market. State officials who'd blamed California's regulations were wrong. Enron had manufactured the crisis for profit. The emails proved it. By the time FERC released the evidence, Enron had already collapsed from accounting fraud. The manipulation had been systematic, documented, and profitable. Most of the traders who'd caused the crisis faced no criminal charges. Legal memos redefined torture in black and white. In 2004, a clue attorneys obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests a series of Justice Department memos written by John Yoo and signed by Assistant Attorney General Jay Bybee. The torture memos, as they became known, provided legal justification for CIA interrogation techniques. The memos redefined torture narrowly, arguing that to constitute torture, pain must be equivalent in intensity to the pain accompanying serious physical injury, such as organ failure, impairment of bodily function, or even death. Under this definition, waterboarding, sleep deprivation for days, confinement in small boxes, and other enhanced interrogation techniques weren't torture. The legal reasoning was torture itself, deliberately narrowing definitions to permit techniques that clearly violated international law. One memo authorized the CIA to use 10 specific techniques in combination. The memos gave interrogators legal cover. They were following guidance from the Justice Department. When the memos became public, the backlash was immediate. The Office of Legal Counsel withdrew them, calling the analysis flawed. But the interrogations had already occurred. Videotapes had already been destroyed. Detainees had already been tortured. You returned to teaching law at Berkeley. Bybee remained a federal appellate judge. The lawyers who'd redefined torture to permit it faced no prosecution, no disbarment, no consequences beyond criticism. Then, the biggest leak in intelligence history materialized. In June 2013, Glenn Greenwald published the first story based on documents provided by NSA contractor Edward Snowden. The Guardian and Washington Post simultaneously released details of PRISM, a program allowing NSA direct access to servers of Google, Facebook, Apple, and other tech companies. Over the following months, Snowden's documents revealed the scope of global surveillance. NSA collection of Verizon phone records covering millions of Americans, monitoring of foreign leaders, including German Chancellor Angela Merkel, partnerships with allied intelligence agencies to circumvent legal restrictions, and bulk collection of internet communications worldwide. The documents proved the surveillance state had capabilities far beyond what had been publicly acknowledged. Director of National Intelligence James Clapper had testified to Congress in March 2013 that the NSA did not wittingly collect data on millions of Americans. The Snowden documents showed that testimony was false. Snowden fled to Hong Kong, then Russia, where he remained in exile. He was charged with espionage. The documents he leaked sparked global debate about privacy versus security, led to some reforms, and revealed that the surveillance exposed by the Church Committee in the 1970s had been quaint compared to digital age capabilities. The leaker became a fugitive. The surveillance programs continued, some reformed, others reauthorized under different names. After exposure came the question of accountability, which rarely had satisfying answers. Daniel Ellsberg faced charges that could have imprisoned him for 115 years. After the Pentagon Papers publication, he was indicted on charges of espionage, theft, and conspiracy. The trial began in Los Angeles in January 1973. Then the government's case collapsed, not because Ellsberg was innocent of leaking classified information, but because the government's conduct was worse. It emerged that the White House plumbers had broken into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, seeking damaging personal information. Judge William Matthew Byrne Jr. revealed that Nixon had offered him the FBI directorship while he was presiding over the trial. The wiretapping of Ellsberg had been illegal. In May 1973, Judge Byrne dismissed all charges due to government misconduct, ruling that the totality of the circumstances of this case offend a sense of justice. Ellsberg walked free. The government's illegal actions in prosecuting him had been worse than his leak. It's the kind of outcome that sounds like justice, except it meant the lies documented in the Pentagon Papers were never formally adjudicated, and the question of whether revealing government deception justified breaking classification law was never resolved. The highest accountability came with the lowest consequences. Richard Nixon resigned on August 9, 1974, the only U.S. president to do so, facing certain impeachment and removal for obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. He left office in disgrace, flew to California, and waited to see if he'd face criminal prosecution for Watergate crimes. He didn't wait long. On September 8, 1974, President Gerald Ford granted Nixon a full and unconditional pardon for any crimes he might have committed while president. Ford called it necessary for national healing, to help the country move past Watergate rather than endure a lengthy trial. The pardon was deeply unpopular. Ford's approval rating dropped 21 points immediately. But it was legal and final. Nixon never faced charges, never stood trial, never admitted guilt beyond saying his actions had been wrong. He spent his remaining years rehabilitating his reputation, writing books, advising on foreign policy, and slowly regaining respectability as an elder statesman. He died in 1994, eulogized by presidents, and buried with full honors. The crimes that drove him from office were pardoned in the name of healing. Whether that healing required letting him escape accountability remained debated for decades. Sometimes convictions vanished on technicalities. Oliver North's convictions for his Iran-Contra crimes, 3 felony counts in 1989, were vacated by the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals in 1990. The appeals court ruled that the trial court hadn't done enough to ensure that witnesses and evidence hadn't been tainted by North's immunized congressional testimony. The ruling acknowledged North had committed the crimes, shredding documents, accepting an illegal gratuity, aiding obstruction of Congress, but held that prosecuting him after he'd testified under immunity created impossible separation of evidence. Independent counsel Lawrence Walsh tried to resurrect the case, but ultimately dismissed remaining charges in 1991. North emerged not just free, but vindicated in some circles, portrayed as a patriotic soldier who'd followed orders and been persecuted for it. He launched a radio show, ran for Senate in Virginia, became a Fox News commentator, and eventually president of the INRA. The conviction vacated, he never served the prison time to which he'd been sentenced. The crimes he'd admitted in testimony disappeared legally, leaving a decorated Marine with a radio career and a political following. Then, there was accountability for exposing crimes rather than committing them. I. Lewis Scooter Libby, Vice President Dick Cheney's chief of staff, was convicted in March 2007 of perjury, obstruction of justice, and making false statements to investigators looking into who had leaked CIA officer Valerie Plame's identity to the press. Plame's husband, Ambassador Joseph Wilson, had written an op-ed disputing Bush administration claims about Iraq seeking uranium from Niger, a key justification for the Iraq War. Shortly after, Plame's covert status was leaked to journalists, effectively ending her intelligence career. Libby was convicted of lying about his conversations with reporters regarding Plame. He was sentenced to 30 months in prison and a $250,000 fine. President Bush commuted the prison sentence in July 2007, calling it excessive, though he left the conviction and fine in place. Libby never served a day in prison for obstructing the investigation into who had destroyed an intelligence officer's career in apparent retaliation for her husband's truthful criticism. In 2018, President Trump granted Libby a full pardon. The leak that exposed a CIA officer remained unpunished. The lies covering it up were pardoned. But one fraudster actually faced consequences that matched his crimes. Bernard Madoff received a 150-year sentence in June 2009 for operating the largest Ponzi scheme in history, defrauding investors of approximately $65 billion. Madoff had run his fraud for decades, using money from new investors to pay returns to earlier investors while fabricating account statements showing consistent profits. The scheme collapsed during the 2008 financial crisis when investors tried to withdraw $7 billion and Madoff couldn't pay. He confessed to his sons, who reported him to authorities. The SEC had received warnings about Madoff for years. Investigator Harry Markopoulos had submitted detailed analyses proving the returns were mathematically impossible. But the agency had failed to investigate adequately. Madoff pleaded guilty to 11 felonies. At sentencing, Judge Denny Chin called the fraud extraordinarily evil and imposed the maximum sentence. Madoff died in prison in 2021. His was one of the rare cases where the punishment actually matched the crime scale, perhaps because he'd stolen from wealthy investors, including charities and pension funds. Perhaps because the fraud was so blatant once exposed. Either way, Madoff served time while Wall Street executives whose frauds had destroyed the economy walked free. Those executives learned they were above prosecution. Not a single top Wall Street executive went to prison for the frauds that caused the 2008 financial crisis. Banks had issued mortgages to borrowers who couldn't afford them, packaged those mortgages into securities rated AAA despite being toxic, sold those securities while betting against them, and triggered a global economic collapse. Attorney General Eric Holder explained the absence of prosecutions in 2013 testimony. I am concerned that the size of some of these institutions becomes so large that it does become difficult for us to prosecute them when we are hit with indications that if you do prosecute, if you do bring a criminal charge, it will have a negative impact on the national economy, perhaps even the world economy. The too big to jail doctrine was now explicit policy. Banks paid civil settlements. J.P. Morgan Chase, $13 billion. Bank of America, $16.65 billion. Citigroup's $7 billion, but these were fractions of the institution's assets and profits, treated as operating costs. The executives who'd committed fraud, who'd knowingly sold garbage investments, who'd destroyed millions of lives and trillions in wealth, faced no criminal consequences. They kept their jobs, their bonuses, their freedom. The system that was supposed to enforce accountability had explicitly decided they were too important to punish. But whistleblowers faced the full force of prosecution. Reality Winner, an NSA contractor, was sentenced to 5 years and 3 months in federal prison in 2018 for leaking a classified document to The Intercept. The document, a 5-page NSA intelligence report, detailed Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. election through hacking voter registration systems. Winner had mailed it anonymously, but The Intercept's handling of the document included details that allowed NSA to identify her. She pleaded guilty to violating the Espionage Act. Her sentence was the longest ever imposed for an unauthorized disclosure to the media, longer than those given to defendants who'd sold secrets to foreign governments for profit. The document she leaked revealed election security threats that arguably the public had a right to know. She served her time, while officials who'd lied about election security, who'd obstructed investigations into foreign interference, who'd traded classified information casually, faced no consequences. Winner was released in 2021. The disparity was stark. Leak information showing threats to democracy, go to prison, commit the frauds and crimes that threaten democracy, keep your position. And some leakers faced potential lifetime exile. Julian Assange, founder of WikiLeaks, was arrested in London in April 2019 after spending 7 years living in Ecuador's embassy to avoid extradition. The U.S. charged him with 18 counts related to obtaining and publishing classified documents, primarily the 2010 leaks of diplomatic cables and Iraq-Afghanistan war logs provided by Chelsea Manning. The charges carried a potential 175-year sentence. Assange's defenders argued he was a journalist publishing newsworthy information. Prosecutors argued he'd actively conspired with Manning to steal classified material, going beyond passive receipt of leaks. The extradition battle continued for years. British courts initially blocked extradition on mental health grounds, then reversed again. The legal question beneath the proceedings: does publishing classified information constitute journalism or espionage? If Assange could be prosecuted for publishing leaked documents, what protections remained for investigative journalism? The case remained unresolved. Assange imprisoned in Britain while fighting extradition, the charges standing as a warning to anyone who might publish government secrets. The documents he'd published had revealed war crimes, diplomatic deceptions, and institutional corruption. Whether publishing them was journalism or espionage was being decided by the same institutions the documents had exposed. The reforms that followed investigations rarely reformed much. After the Church Committee exposed CIA abuses in 1975, Congress passed the Intelligence Oversight Act of 1976, requiring intelligence agencies to keep congressional intelligence committees fully and currently informed of their activities. The reforms sounded substantive. The loopholes were substantial. Agencies could limit notification to the Gang of Eight, congressional leaders and intelligence committee chairs who couldn't share information with other members or staff. Presidential findings could authorize covert operations without full congressional knowledge. The notification requirement said timely, not before the fact, allowing retroactive briefings. The reform created the appearance of oversight while preserving operational secrecy. When Iran-Contra broke a decade later, it demonstrated how easily the oversight could be circumvented. The CIA had evolved. The reforms had created new procedures. Fundamental accountability remained elusive. A folder containing the Church Committee reforms sat in congressional archives, the same folder that would later hold Iran-Contra investigations, torture reports, surveillance revelations. Different scandals, same institutional pattern: expose, reform, continue. Then came a court that operated in shadows. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, created by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978, was established to oversee government surveillance requests. The FISA court operates in secret, hears only government arguments, and approves or denies warrants for electronic surveillance and physical searches targeting foreign intelligence. Between 1979 and 2012, the court approved 33,942 surveillance applications and rejected 11, an approval rate of 99.97%. Even applications modified by the court are eventually approved. The court's proceedings are classified. Its rulings create secret law interpreting surveillance authority. When the Patriot Act expanded FISA authority after 9/11, the court approved bulk collection of phone metadata, secret interpretations of the law's scope, and surveillance programs the public didn't know existed until Snowden's leaks. The reform meant to check surveillance power had become a rubber stamp, legitimizing in secret what couldn't survive public scrutiny. The court provided legal cover for programs that might be unconstitutional, operating in a parallel system where normal adversarial process didn't exist. Whistleblowers got protection that protected very little. The Whistleblower Protection Act passed in 1989 to shield federal employees who reported waste, fraud, and abuse. The law sounded strong, prohibiting retaliation, creating appeal rights, establishing channels for disclosure. In practice, the protections were weak. Intelligence agency employees were largely exempted. Contractors weren't covered initially. Retaliation could take forms the law didn't address: transfers, negative reviews, hostile work environments. The law required whistleblowers to prove retaliation was the primary cause of adverse action, a difficult standard. Many who reported wrongdoing faced career destruction anyway. Thomas Drake at NSA, who reported waste in a surveillance program, faced Espionage Act charges after using official channels failed. The law was strengthened in 2012, expanding coverage and lowering the burden of proof. But Reality Winner, who leaked evidence of election interference, still went to prison. Edward Snowden, who revealed unconstitutional surveillance, still lived in exile. The protection existed on paper. In practice, whistleblowing often meant choosing between conscience and career, sometimes between truth and freedom. Corporate fraud triggered accounting reforms that barely bit. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act, passed in 2002 after Enron and WorldCom collapsed, imposed new requirements on corporate boards and auditors. CEOs and CFOs had to personally certify financial statements. Companies had to document internal controls. Auditing firms couldn't provide certain consulting services to audit clients, addressing conflicts of interest that had compromised Arthur Andersen's Enron audit. The Public Company Accounting Oversight Board was created to regulate auditors. The reforms addressed real problems. The enforcement was minimal. Companies spent millions on compliance, documenting controls, filing certifications, creating paperwork trails without fundamentally changing behavior. When the 2008 financial crisis revealed banks had systemically committed fraud in mortgage securitization, Sarbanes-Oxley didn't prevent it, didn't detect it early, and didn't facilitate prosecutions. The penalties for violations were rarely imposed. The law created process, not accountability. The folder holding the reform had initially represented hope for genuine change. Gradually, it became evidence that reform often meant new compliance procedures while preserving the underlying power structure. Financial reform followed the same pattern. Dodd-Frank, passed in 2010 after the financial crisis, was sold as comprehensive reform, new Consumer Protection Bureau, restrictions on proprietary trading, the Volcker Rule, oversight of derivatives, higher capital requirements for banks. The law ran 2,300 pages, requiring hundreds of regulations to implement. Industry lobbying immediately began weakening it. The Volcker Rule was delayed, then implemented with enough exemptions to preserve most profitable trading. Derivatives regulation was carved with exceptions. Capital requirements were phased in slowly. In 2018, Congress rolled back portions of Dodd-Frank, reducing oversight of regional banks. Silicon Valley Bank, freed from stricter oversight by this rollback, collapsed in 2023 after making the exact kinds of risky decisions the law was meant to prevent. Dodd-Frank created bureaucracy without fundamentally changing how finance operated. The biggest banks became bigger. The systemic risks remained. The reform was real enough to cite, weak enough not to threaten profits. Surveillance reform was similar theater. The USA Freedom Act, passed in 2015, was meant to reform NSA surveillance after Snowden's revelations. The law ended the NSA's bulk collection of phone metadata, technically. Instead of collecting the data itself, NSA would query phone companies' databases when needed. The program moved. It didn't end. Section 215 of the Patriot Act, which had authorized bulk collection, was modified but not eliminated. The provision expired in 2020, then was renewed in 2020 with minimal changes. FISA court oversight continued. Still secret, still approving nearly everything. The surveillance infrastructure remained intact, operating under different authorities. The reform addressed the most visible abuse while preserving the capabilities. It was enough to claim action without actually restricting power. The pattern repeated: scandal, investigation, reform that looked substantial, but changed little. The Lobbying Disclosure Act of 1995 required lobbyists to register and report their activities quarterly. They had to disclose who paid them, which officials they contacted, and what issues they lobbied on. Transparency sounded good. Enforcement was minimal. The Justice Department's lobbying enforcement section rarely prosecuted violations. When Jack Abramoff's bribery scandal broke in 2006, revealing systematic corruption through lobbying, the response was the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act of 2007, adding more requirements, longer cooling-off periods before officials could become lobbyists, more disclosure of campaign contributions, restrictions on gifts and travel. The reforms created more paperwork. The lobbying continued. Spending on federal lobbying exceeded $3 billion annually throughout the 2010s. The disclosure laws meant the public could see influence being purchased, but watching it happen wasn't the same as stopping it. The folder containing lobbying reforms grew thicker, while the influence market grew larger. The Foreign Agents Registration Act, passed in 1938 to combat Nazi propaganda, required agents representing foreign governments to register and disclose their activities. For decades, it was barely enforced. FARA prosecutions were extraordinarily rare. The law was used occasionally against obvious cases: Soviet propagandists, foreign government public relations. Most lobbyists working for foreign interests didn't register, claiming they were lobbying, not representing foreign principles, a distinction lawyers could navigate easily. Then, Paul Manafort, Trump's campaign chairman, was prosecuted for FARA violations as part of the Mueller investigation. He'd lobbied for Ukrainian interests without registering. Suddenly, FARA had teeth. Except mostly in political prosecutions. The Justice Department's FARA unit remained small, enforcement sporadic, and compliance voluntary for anyone whose foreign representation didn't become politically inconvenient. The law existed. Its enforcement remained selective enough that it functioned more as a political tool than genuine regulation of foreign influence. And then the pattern just continued, dressed in newer clothes. In March 2018, whistleblower Christopher Wiley revealed that Cambridge Analytica had harvested personal data from 87 million Facebook users without consent, using it to build psychological profiles for political advertising. The data had been obtained through a personality quiz app that collected information not just from quiz takers, but their entire friend networks. Facebook had known about the breach since 2015, but hadn't disclosed it publicly. Congressional hearings followed. Mark Zuckerberg apologized. The FTC investigated, ultimately fining Facebook $5 billion in 2019, the largest privacy penalty in history. but approximately 1 month of Facebook's revenue. Cambridge Analytica shut down, declaring bankruptcy. But Facebook's core business model, collecting vast user data and selling access to advertisers, continued unchanged. The platform that had enabled the breach kept operating exactly as before, with minor adjustments to privacy settings and user agreements. The company rebranded to Meta. The data harvesting continued under different terms of service. The folder that once held tobacco industry documents showing corporate knowledge of harm now held tech company testimonies showing knowledge of privacy violations. Different industry, same institutional pattern. On October 29, 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 crashed into the Java Sea, killing all 189 people aboard. On March 10, 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 crashed, killing all 157 people aboard. Both were Boeing 737 MAX aircraft. Both crashes resulted from a poorly designed automated system called MIPCAS that pushed the nose down based on a single sensor, which pilots hadn't been properly trained to override. Congressional hearings in 2019 revealed Boeing had rushed the MAX to market to compete with Airbus, prioritizing speed over safety. The FAA had delegated much of the safety certification to Boeing itself, letting the manufacturer essentially approve its own aircraft. Internal Boeing messages showed employees mocking regulators and discussing hiding MIPCAS information. The 737 MAX was grounded worldwide for 20 months. Boeing paid settlements to crash victims' families and a $2.5 billion fine. But the FAA's practice of delegating certification to manufacturers continued. Boeing's leadership faced no criminal charges. The same cost-cutting culture remained in place, contributing to later incidents, including a door plug blowing off a MAX 9 in January 2024. The crashes killed 346 people. The system that enabled the unsafe aircraft remained largely unchanged. Purdue Pharma, owned by the Sackler family, aggressively marketed OxyContin starting in the late 1990s, downplaying addiction risks while encouraging doctors to prescribe opioids for chronic pain. Internal documents showed the company knew OxyContin was being abused and diverted to illegal use, but continued marketing it. The opioid crisis killed over 500,000 Americans between 1999 and 2019. In 2007, Purdue and 3 executives pleaded guilty to misleading doctors and patients about OxyContin's addiction potential, paying $634 million in fines. The marketing continued. By 2019, facing thousands of lawsuits from states, counties, and cities devastated by opioid addiction, Purdue filed for bankruptcy. The bankruptcy settlement, approved in 2021, dissolved Purdue, directing billions toward addiction treatment and prevention. The Sackler family agreed to pay $4.5 billion over 9 years. In exchange, they received immunity from all current and future civil opioid litigation. The family, whose estimated wealth exceeded $10 billion built from OxyContin profits, would pay a fraction of that fortune while escaping further liability. No Sackler faced criminal charges. The bankruptcy process that was meant to provide justice for victims instead provided the perpetrators immunity, while they retained billions. The folder holding the settlement agreement sat in the same filing system that once held tobacco settlements. Different addictive product. Same protection for executives who'd knowingly caused addiction. In December 2020, cybersecurity firm FireEye discovered that Russian intelligence had compromised SolarWinds, a company providing network management software to 18,000 customers, including most U.S. government agencies. The hackers had inserted malware into SolarWinds updates, giving them access to customer networks for months undetected. At least 9 federal agencies and 100 private companies were compromised, including the Treasury, Justice, and Commerce departments. SolarWinds had known its security was inadequate. An intern password SolarWinds 123 had been posted online in 2019, and executives had sold stock before the breach was disclosed. Congressional testimony revealed the hack had been ongoing since March 2020, undetected for 9 months. The disclosure was delayed. Affected agencies learned they'd been hacked from private cybersecurity firms, not from government monitoring. SolarWinds remained operational, continuing to provide software to government agencies. No executives faced charges for the security negligence that enabled one of the largest intelligence breaches in history. Government contracts continued. The same patterns of insufficient security, delayed disclosure, and minimal accountability played out again. The memo folder that had begun with Operation Northwoods, documenting institutional willingness to sacrifice truth for expediency, now held breach notifications and continued contracts. The pattern hadn't changed. Only the technology had updated. The office stayed occupied. The promises kept being made. Different faces behind the same desk, different scandals with the same shape, different technology enabling the same evasions. The 99 cases weren't outliers. They were the pattern emerging from fog, the machinery of power operating exactly as designed. Some reforms happened. Some prosecutions succeeded. Some consequences arrived. But the fundamental structure held. Those with institutional protection usually kept it. Those who exposed wrongdoing usually paid more than those who committed it, and the reforms most often reorganized appearances rather than redistributing power. The government memo folder sat in archives now, thicker than when it began, holding documentation of every exposure and every inadequate reform. It had transformed from symbol of accountability to evidence of pattern to standard operating procedure. The same folder, the same filing system, the same institutional continuity beneath the surface scandals. Rest easy knowing you're among the few who actually know. The truth was documented, investigated, sometimes reformed, and then, most remarkably, it simply continued, slightly modified, under new names, with the same essential mechanisms intact. That's not conspiracy. That's just how institutions work when accountability is optional and power protects itself. The lamp stays lit. The archives remain open. The next folder is already being filled.